Dear fellow scholars, this is a new episode with a special guest. Today, we are going to find out what a 3,000-year-old brain looks like. You heard that right. Scientists just found fossilized brains in a Moroccan cave. And not only that, they were able to scan them too. This is an incredible discovery for our understanding of human evolution. But why don't we talk about this more often? What happened to the brains of our ancestors? Why did our relatives from 500,000 years ago have such big brains? Did they use their brains differently than we do today? And why can we learn so much from a 3,000-year-old brain scan? And here comes the first surprise. Yes, the outside of this brain is fossilized, but the inside isn't. Let's see how they managed to study this. They used non-invasive techniques such as X-ray computed tomography, which has become very popular in medical sciences in recent years. This technique creates detailed images without cutting up the fossil. That is excellent, because it would be really hard to obtain funding for cutting up the world's oldest known complete human brain. Well, maybe not that hard, but it would certainly be unethical. And look, the image that we see here is not the image of the fossilized outer shell only. No, sir. Here we see the reconstructed surface of the brain after removing the outer layer of tissue. So this is the outer layer of the fossilized brain. And this dark structure here is the dura mater. This is a tough fibrous tissue that protects the brain, and in some species it even fuses together to form a shell. But then what is this? Yes. This is the outer covering of the brain. It is not the skull, but the meninges. These are layers of protective tissues surrounding the brain. So this part right here was not filled with air. Instead, there was a liquid similar to cerebrospinal fluid circulating around the brain to protect it. This means that this is a real soft brain, albeit a very old one. It just happens to be exceptionally well preserved. Not even that. While it is indeed 300,000 years old, it is at most 40,000 years old. How do scientists know this? Because they dated the sediments above the skulls. If you want to learn more about how scientists date fossils, I recommend that you check out this video. It will tell you everything you need to know. So what do we see here? Is this the shape of the brain of our ancestor, Homo Heidelbergensis? No, this is the shape of the brain of Homo sapiens, us. Look, these individuals had a brain that looked like ours, but they lived 300,000 years ago. We are talking about a time before the appearance of any modern humans in Europe. So what does this mean? Did modern humans live in Africa 300,000 years ago? No, not quite. See, we didn't just pop into existence. We evolved into being. Our species likely originated in Africa, but different populations of Homo sapiens interbred with other human species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. For example, you and I have between 1% and 4% of our DNA coming from these ancient relatives of ours. The way it went down is that modern humans evolved from Homo Heidelbergensis, and this likely happened in Africa. Some stayed behind, while others moved north and became Homo ergaster and later Homo erectus. These two species then migrated to Asia and Europe. Then some returned to Africa, interbred with Homo sapiens, and some of our genes ended up in the genome of present-day humans. A bit later, another migration brought Homo heidelbergensis into Europe, where they evolved into Neanderthals and Denisovans. Again, they interbred with Homo sapiens when they met. And all this time, Homo sapiens was evolving in Africa. After some more time, some of them moved out of Africa and replaced the other human species. However, this process wasn't quick. It took tens of thousands of years. So the question is, when did this take place? When did Homo sapiens evolve? Well, according to the previous ideas, this happened no earlier than 200,000 years ago. However, the results of this study suggest that Homo sapiens may have been around for quite a bit longer than that. They could have been around for 600,000 years already. See, this 3,000-year-old brain is basically indistinguishable from ours. Sure, there are some minor differences, but considering how long the time between these two brains is, they are basically the same. What does this mean? It means that the major increase in brain size occurred earlier than expected. The brains of our direct ancestors, Homo Heidelbergensis, increased in size around 700,000 years ago, and these brains were 50% larger than ours. Then for a long time, nothing happened. They stayed roughly the same size until 300,000 years ago, at least in Africa. In Europe, the hominins along the migration route went through a second increase in brain size, and this is when they split off into different species. Now, we should also have a look at this. Yes, the difference in brain size between these two species is truly astounding. The brain of the ancestor is simply gigantic compared to the brain of Homo sapiens. It must have weighed around 1,400 to 1,600 cubic centimeters. That is 20 to 40% larger than ours. However, if we control for body mass, we find that their brains were still roughly 50% larger than ours. So why do we have smaller brains? Was there a reason for this? Well, I think there is one. You see, the key to understanding how our brain works lies in efficiency. Now hold on. I know that sounds weird. Of course, bigger is better, right? Well, not necessarily. It is better to have fewer, larger neurons with many connections between them. This is because the signal needs to travel only a short distance between the neurons, and thus the electrical signal can travel quickly. Smaller neurons with many connections, on the other hand, have a large surface area, but the distance the signal needs to travel is larger. Thus, the signal slows down. What this means is that having a lot of small neurons is not as good as having fewer, larger neurons. And you can see this by looking at the ratio of gray to white matter. Gray matter contains the neuron cell bodies, while white matter contains the fatty tissue around the neurons. This is important because the fatty tissue allows signals to travel faster. In animals with smaller brains, we typically see a lower proportion of white matter. That is because the surface area of the brain doesn't scale with volume. If you make the brain smaller, you get less gray matter, but you also get much less white matter. And exactly this happened in our lineage. Having a smaller brain meant less gray matter, but also importantly, less white matter. And this may have been the reason why our brains got smaller. The fact that our ancestors had so much less white matter likely meant that their brains worked differently than ours. That is because white matter is crucial for communication between the different parts of the brain. So making the brain smaller reduced the amount of white matter, which in turn changed how the different parts of the brain communicated with each other. In other words, our smaller brains work differently from our ancestors' bigger brains. I find this a fascinating insight, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think? Why did our brains get smaller? And while scientists haven't found the answer to that, they did manage to find the answer to another question. It turns out that their relative, Homo Heidelbergensis, used tools almost as sophisticated as ours. They built shelters and used fire. They hunted large mammals and lived in social groups. They were likely the first humans who routinely used language and had rituals. They may have been the first humans who buried their dead, too. In other words, these guys weren't just smart. They were super smart. I absolutely love these amazing discoveries. They teach us so much about how we came to be who we are. Thanks for watching. And for now, let the exploration of ancient brains begin. Subscribe if you wish to see more.